Good morning. Today we look at 2 Chronicles 28 and 29. Today is June 6th. It's June 6, 1944 with D-Day, the day that Allied forces stormed the beach of Normandy. And I just saw a picture of a proclamation from Dwight Eisenhower that a man said was in his dad's possession. You know, and it talked about that D-Day. And it was one of the big turning points of World War II. The German army under Hitler had kind of refocused to the Western Front against Russia, but they were still heavily entrenched and guarded the beaches, and there were tremendous casualties on that D-Day, June 6, 1944. It's a day that, as many say, lives on in infamy. Memorial Day, we remembered many of those who had died in the service to our country and to the world. But it's just a reminder of, you know, today is one of those solemn days in so many ways. It's like December 7th, another day, you know, the bombing of the Pearl Harbor. I mean, it changed the world. I mean, that was the day that brought the United States fully into World War II, and changed so much. June 6th has another meaning for me. On this date, 48 years ago, there were two young people stood in front of family, friends, and a pastor and said, "I do." So thanks, dear. And going on now with the Bible study as we are looking at these two chapters, and again we continue. Chapter 28 deals with Ahaz. Chapter 29 begins to deal with Hezekiah, who is and we'll have 4 chapters dealing with Hezekiah. Just as in Kings we had Hezekiah was devoted more time there. He was a reformer. He was one who brought the Israelites back. Ahaz here in chapter 28, you know, it says he did not do what was right in the sight of the Lord. I mean, he stripped the temple. He closed the temple up, you know, and he worshipped false gods. You know, he'd been defeated because he had fallen away from God. He'd been defeated by the king of Israel, and many of the Judahites, you know, fellow Israelites, had been taken captive. He sought help from King Ahaz, from the king of Assyria, and rather than help, the king of Assyria came and plundered him even more, you know, and he found more problems with someone that he had asked for help from. But, you know, verse 4 of chapter 29 said, Ahaz sacrificed and made offerings on the high places, on the hills, and under every green tree. I mean, he was worshiping anything and everything but God, setting up false temples to these Baals. And I find it interesting that the person who writes Chronicles says Baals. You know, it's false gods. You know, Baal was one false god, but, you know, he just kind of lumps a lot of the false gods into this one term. And rightly so. I mean, there is only one God worthy of worship and praise. Verse 5 says, therefore, because he had done all this, the Lord God gave him a king into the hand of the king of Aram, who defeated him, took a great number of people, and brought them to Damascus. And then given into the hand of the king of Israel, as I mentioned, and the king of Israel, they took, what was 200,000 captives, women, children, you know, men, sons, daughters, and they were taking them up to the northern kingdom. You know, Israel refers to the northern kingdom. And this prophet, Oded, comes and he meets the king of Israel, and he says, you've taken captive your fellow people. You know, even though there's split kingdoms, northern Israel and southern Judah, you're the same people. You know, you're all Israelites, you're all Jews, you're the people chosen by God, and you have done wrong to take all of these people and think you're going to make them your slaves. He says, what have you except sins against the Lord your God? You know, and then Oded says, you know, and and the king of Israel realizes that, our guilt is great. He says, our guilt is already great, and there is fierce wrath against Israel. This is the prophet. He's understanding that, Israel, the northern kingdom, has not been following God, and they haven't. We haven't read a lot about them in Chronicles, but we read about their indiscretion and their unfaithfulness in books of Kings. But so in verse 14 says, the warriors left the captives and the booties, and they were all set free. And with the booty and they clothed those who had no clothing. They fed them, and they sent them on their way again, and back to Judah. And this is now then when it tells us that the king of Judah, Ahaz, seeks help from the king of Assyria, because the Edomites, another country, had invaded and captured. And, and again, it's just war, battle, fight. It's trying to get land and captive, take captives for slaves. And we may look at the Israelites and say, man, they're a warring people. And definitely they were in a lot of wars. But I think about the stories of the Native Americans. I mean, how the tribes would raid each other, and throughout all of history. I mean, the battle for a little bit more land. I mean, my dad's parents, my ancestors came from a part of Germany that at one point was Denmark. So my name, Christian Sen, spelled with an S-E-N, is a Danish spelling. Yet my dad's heritage is German because of this warring factor that had gone on in this part of Germany. The Thames area was captured, taken from Denmark. We need more land. And so it isn't just the Israelites that are fighting. I mean, the whole world. I mean, and it's no different today. Again, look at the wars and the battles and the unrest that's going on. Israel, Ukraine, and we don't hear much about them. So, maybe quite as much as we did for a while, but it's still a war-torn area, and there's still conflict in the world. Verse 22 of chapter 28 says that in his time of distress, Ahaz the king, he became even more faithless to God. Rather than realizing his mistake, rather than realizing that his strength and help could come from coming back to worship God, he continues to worship other gods even more. He figures that, the God of the Edomites must be more powerful than our God because they defeated us. So he worships more false gods, and it's just, a vicious spiral that goes downhill until his death. And then at his death, when he's buried, Hezekiah becomes the king. And it's, he, in verse 2, he did what was right in the sight of the Lord, just as his ancestor David. So, the chronicler, that's the person that writes this book, just a way to refer to the author, make sure that we know that these different kings are descendants of King David. That, that the royal line is just like, the priests are to be from the Levitical clan, from the descendants of Aaron that way. But the kings continue to be the line of David. You continue to follow that genealogy. And he's faithful to God. So verse 3, in the first month of his reign. So this young man, he's 29 when he becomes king, is smart enough, he's got good enough advisors, maybe, or whatever, but he understands that we need to get back to God. We need to get back to God. And how much of our world needs that today? To get back to God, rather than all of the self-focus and it's all me. But in the first month of his reign, he opens the doors and he tells the priests and the Levites, get God's house in order. And they spend 16 days getting everything ready. It says they began to sanctify on the first day of the month. On the 8th day, they came to the vestibule. For 8 more days, they sanctified. And on the 16th day of the first month, they finished. They went inside, and King Hezekiah comes with an offering. But he does it correctly. He comes with an offering for the priests and the Levites to make the offering. The king doesn't try to make the offering himself. That would have been a sin. That would have been wrong. But he comes and he does it correctly. And the people come with offerings back to ask God to be back in their lives, to ask God to faithfully lead and guide them. And as it said, King Hezekiah was faithful to God. Well, God again is faithful to his people.